In 1999, a murder shook Japan to its core. The victim was Namiko Takaba, a young homemaker stabbed to death inside her own rented apartment. And if that wasn't heartbreaking enough, her 2-year-old son, a little boy named Kohei, was right there when it happened. He saw everything. Police launched a massive manhunt, but the killer simply vanished. No trail, no arrest, nothing. For decades, this case haunted Japan, and many people started to believe it would never be solved. But then, October 31st, 2025, about 7 months ago now, in a quiet neighborhood in Nishiku, Nagoya City, a 69-year-old man named Satoru Takaba stood holding his old, beaten-up cell phone. A single sentence from a department administrator had just come through the line, and it stopped him cold. He stood frozen in front of a family photograph on the wall for over half an hour. The DNA had finally matched. This man had spent 22 million Japanese yen, roughly $150,000, just to keep a crime scene intact. He had been waiting 26 years for this moment. When the murder happened, Mr. Satoru was a middle-aged man with jet black hair. Now his temples had gone silver, but his fist, still clenched tight around a set of keys, told you everything about who he was. That brass Mitsubishi key, the one that once opened his wife's apartment door, had been worn smooth by decades of handling. Just like his life, ground down but never broken by that single terrible day. Over those 26 years, more than 101,000 investigators had touched this case. They collected 5,217 statements and looked hard at over 3,800 suspects. And through all of it, Mr. Satoru showed up to that apartment every single month. Not to live there, not to grieve there, but to replace the dehumidifier packs. That empty room had long since stopped being just a crime scene. It had become something closer to a prayer, his prayer for justice. So let's go back to where it all started. A Saturday afternoon in 1999. Nobody knows exactly what happened inside apartment 302 that day. But what we do know is that this case would go on to become one of the most remarkable examples of crime scene preservation and criminal investigation in all of Japanese history. Back then, the Enabaji district in Nishiki, Nagoya was a pretty ordinary place. Rows of 5- and 6-story apartment buildings, working-class families, nothing that would make you look twice. The Satoru Takaba family lived in apartment 302 on the west side of the 3rd floor. The unit was a little on the dark side, but if you looked out the window on a clear day, you could just make out Nagoya Castle in the distance. It was around 2:07 in the afternoon on October 13th when Mr. Tanaka Kenichi, the building's landlord, made his way up to apartment 302. He was carrying a small jar of homemade plum jam. He wanted to stop by and thank Mrs. Namiko for accepting an important package on his behalf the day before. But when he reached her door, something was off, and there was a smell, faint, metallic, the unmistakable scent of blood. He called out, no answer. He called out again, still nothing. So he gently pushed the door open and stepped inside. What he saw stopped him cold. Namiko was lying motionless on the hallway floor in a pool of blood. And right beside her, her 2-year-old son, Kohei. His little clothes were soaked in blood. He was still holding his toy car, patting his mother's body like he was trying to wake her up. Mr. Tanaka's legs gave out from under him. He had to press himself against the wall just to stay upright. His hands were shaking so badly that he misdialed 3 times before he finally got through to the police. About 20 minutes later, a team of 8 officers from the Aichi Prefectural Police Department arrived on scene, armed with the best forensic technology available at the time. The entire building was locked down immediately, cordoned off into an inner investigation zone and an outer perimeter. Nobody in, nobody out. The preliminary autopsy told them Namiko had been dead for roughly 2 to 3 hours, killed by severe wounds to her neck and chest. The cause of death was massive blood loss from sharp force trauma. At the entrance to the apartment, investigators found several clear shoe prints. Women's shoes, size 24 centimeters, a limited edition Korean athletic shoe brand that wasn't widely sold in Japan at the time. There were also small blood drops on the entryway floor, trailing inward. In the bathroom, a thin smear of blood remained in the sink, not quite washed away. Forensic testing confirmed that all of these bloodstains were type B. Namiko's blood type was A. None of it was hers. Back in 1999, DNA extraction wasn't yet possible with the technology they had. Blood typing was as far as they could go. But from that alone, investigators built a theory. The killer had cut themselves during the attack, slipped into the bathroom to clean the wound, and then fled. There was one more thing on the dining table that caught their attention: a persimmon. 3 clear fingerprints lifted from the skin of the fruit. None of them matched anyone in the Takaba family. When Mr. Satoru got the call from police, he jumped into a taxi and rode home with dread eating at him the entire way. The moment he stepped through that door, his knees buckled. Officers had to hold him up. He saw his wife's body. He saw his little boy, covered in blood. And this man, who by all accounts was calm and composed by nature, completely fell apart. He wept, and he kept murmuring the same words over and over. "It was fine this morning. It was fine this morning." He told police that around 8 a.m., he had left for work to deal with an urgent matter at the office. Namiko had walked him to the door. She mentioned that Kohei had a slight fever and that she was going to take him to get checked out, that she'd be home early that evening. That was the last conversation they ever had, a goodbye that neither of them knew was permanent. Using testimony from 2 witnesses, phone records, and purchase histories from local stores, police were able to reconstruct a detailed minute-by-minute timeline of Namiko's final morning. After Mr. Satoru left for work, Namiko called a neighborhood clinic to ask about caring for a child with a mild fever. Her voice was calm, gentle, no sign of anything wrong. At 9:03 a.m., she called the Mama Numo Child Rearing Support Center to book a taxi for 3 p.m. She was planning to take Kohei to a pediatric hospital that afternoon. Then at 9:35 a.m., a delivery driver named Machimoto Akira from Yamato Transport, one of Japan's biggest courier services, showed up at apartment 302 with an order of milk powder and diapers. He rang the bell 3 times, called out, got no response. He assumed no one was home and left a delivery notice in the door, signed with his name and the time. At 10:12 a.m. and again at 10:40 a.m., the Child Rearing Support Center called Namiko back, first to confirm the taxi booking, then to pass along the driver's name and contact number. Both times, the phone just rang. The staff thought maybe she had the baby down for a nap and didn't want to push it, so they let it go. Then around 11 a.m., a neighbor named Satoru Takaba was heading downstairs to take out her trash when she spotted Namiko coming out of the building with Kohei in her arms, heading toward the clinic. They exchanged a few words. Namiko mentioned the fever still hadn't broken, and she wanted to get him looked at just to be safe. From 11:10 to 11:40 a.m., Namiko was at the Ogawa Pediatric Clinic with Kohei. The little boy was diagnosed with viral influenza and sent home with children's fever reducers. One of the nurses there remembered Namiko clearly. She was the kind of mother who asked every question she could think of, took careful notes in a small notebook, wanted to make sure she was doing everything right. At 11:42 a.m., the clinic's security camera caught her on footage, carrying Kohei, walking back in the direction of the apartment building. Between 11:55 and 12:05 p.m., Namiko stopped at the small convenience store on the ground floor of the complex. The store owner remembered her buying a bottle of mineral water and a pack of wet wipes, 180 yen, just over $1. She asked him to keep an eye on Kohei for just a moment while she stepped over to the vending machine nearby to grab a can of warm milk. The store's cash register receipt and the vending machine's transaction log both confirmed the timing. Then, around 12:15 p.m., the neighbor in apartment 301, Mrs. Satoru Takaba, was in her kitchen chopping vegetables when she heard something from next door. A thud, like a chair hitting the floor. And then, a short, sharp scream, a woman's voice. It lasted maybe a second or two, and then it just stopped. Mrs. Sato assumed it was kids playing around, maybe knocked something over. She didn't think much of it and went back to what she was doing. But that sound, that single cut-off scream, lined up almost exactly with the time of death the medical examiner would later estimate for Namiko. At around 12:24 p.m., a third-floor resident named Ms. Koriko saw a woman in a dark coat rushing down the stairwell, gripping her right wrist tightly. At almost the same moment, a taxi driver named Yamachita Ryosuke was walking back to his building after finishing his shift when he spotted the same woman at the entrance to the complex. He put her at around 40 years old, dark gray coat, black pants, head down, moving fast. Her right hand was clamped hard around her left wrist, and something red was dripping from it, blood. Mr. Yamashita tried to ask if she needed help. She didn't respond. She just picked up her pace and headed straight for the bus stop. He remembered enough detail about her height, her build, and the specific shoes she was wearing that his account became the foundation for the police sketch of the suspect. At the base of the apartment building, police collected several drops of type B blood from the ground. But the most promising lead wasn't the blood, it was the dirt. The soil clinging to those shoe prints inside the apartment contained trace components that were traced back to a specific park near Inabaji District. That told investigators something important. The mud had already been on the suspect's shoes before they ever walked through Namiko's door. The park was only about 800 meters away, and it had public restrooms, exactly the kind of place someone with a fresh wound would duck into to clean up. And sure enough, when police checked the restroom on the east side of the park, they found type B bloodstains in the sink, same origin as the blood at the crime scene. Out on the gravel path just outside the restroom, they recovered shoe prints with a matching tread pattern. It was all fitting together, but then the trail went cold. In 1999, surveillance camera coverage in that part of the city was less than 30%. The west side of the park fed into a maze of narrow, unmarked back alleys. After treating their wound, the suspect could have slipped into the crowded commercial district, where there were no cameras, or gotten into a private vehicle that was never logged anywhere. Police lost the trail completely at an intersection west of the park. That same evening, at 8 p.m., the Aichi Prefectural Police Department put together a special task force, 50 seasoned criminal investigators working around the clock, no days off. Their job was to build a profile of the killer and figure out where to point the investigation next. They started where you always start, the people closest to the victim. As the husband, Satoru Takaba was the first one in the interrogation room. Police went through everything. His job, his finances, his social life, his every move on the day of the murder. His alibi held up solid. People who knew the couple, neighbors, relatives, all said the same thing. They had a good marriage, no serious fights, no signs of cheating, no talk of separation. Mr. Satoru was cleared. There was one wrinkle though. Mr. Satoru had been briefly married before, to a woman named Yamaguchi Yukiko. The divorce had been messy, with disputes over assets, and Yukiko had reportedly threatened that he would never have peace. That gave her a potential motive. But when police dug into it, they found she had been on a business trip in Gifu Prefecture the entire day of the murder. There was simply no way she could have done it. Next, police turned their attention to the Mama Nomo Child Rearing Support Center, a group Namiko had been an active member of. There were 23 members total who had regular contact with her. 5 of them had had minor disagreements with Namiko over parenting philosophies. Small stuff, but enough to put them on the radar. Police investigated all 5 thoroughly. Every single one of them came up clean. From there, investigators systematically worked through 10 households in the immediate vicinity of apartment 302. They also investigated 43 people from the broader community who had interacted with Namiko at some point, and 32 former colleagues and clients from the trading company where she had worked before getting married. They turned over every stone they could find. Nothing. The case had hit a wall. By the year 2000, with the investigation into Namiko's personal circle essentially exhausted, the Special Task Force made a pivot. They shifted their focus to 3 key pieces of physical evidence: the limited edition Korean women's shoes, the persimmon on the dining table, and the type B bloodstains. It felt like a fresh start, and for a brief moment, The shoes in particular looked like they might crack the whole case wide open. Police contacted the Japanese branch of the shoe company and pulled the full domestic sales record. 352 pairs sold across Japan, 17 of them in the Nagoya area. Investigators tracked down all 17 buyers and verified their identities, their alibis, their shoe sizes, and the specific model details. 12 had airtight alibis. 3 had immigrated abroad and could be confirmed overseas at the time of the murder. The remaining 2 had no clear alibi, but their shoe sizes didn't match the prints at the scene. All 17 were clear. Just like that, the most promising lead they had went nowhere. Then, in the autumn of 2001, something small happened, something that no one fully appreciated at the time. Little Kohei, who had just turned 4 years old, was sitting in a kindergarten art class. The theme that day was My Family. Out of nowhere, he looked up at his teacher and said, "Mom was pushed down by the convenience store clerk. Her hand was bleeding." The statement was noted and filed away in his child psychology counseling records. At the time, police didn't put much weight on it. The convenience store clerk had no clear identity. Everyone knew that young children's memories could be unreliable, easily shaped by imagination or fragments of things they'd overheard. So they logged it as supplementary information and moved on. They had no way of knowing that those 2 quiet sentences from a 4-year-old boy would turn out to be one of the most critical clues in the entire case. And that it would take another 24 years for anyone to truly understand why. On October 18, 1999, Namiko's funeral was held at the Nagoya City Funeral Hall. Hundreds of people came, neighbors, Mr. Satoru's co-workers, members of the Mama no Tomo group, all there to say goodbye. Baby Kohei was held in his grandmother's arms the entire time, looking out at the crowd with those wide, innocent eyes, not yet old enough to understand that his mother was never coming home. Mr. Satoru stood at the front of the room, holding a photo of Namiko that he had cut from a family picture. "I will definitely find the killer to avenge you." Those words didn't leave him. For the next 26 years, they became the thing he lived for. After the funeral, Mr. Satoru made a decision that stunned just about everyone who knew him. He packed up and moved with Kohei to live with his mother, but he kept paying the rent on apartment 302. 60,000 yen a month, roughly $400, and he made one thing absolutely clear. Nothing in that room was to be touched. Everything stayed exactly as it was. In his written statement to the police, he put it simply, "There are definitely clues at the scene. I cannot let them disappear." The special investigation team didn't just support his decision, they got fully on board. Mr. Mizoto Soji, who was heading up the task force at the time, sat down with Mr. Satoru personally and walked him through exactly why preserving the scene mattered so much. The bloodstains, the shoe prints at the entrance, even microscopic airborne particles, any of it could become the key to solving the case down the road once technology caught up. The police would back him up with technical guidance every step of the way. The forensic science department drew up a detailed preservation plan specifically for apartment 302. A special transparent protective film, waterproof, dustproof, oxidation-resistant, was laid over the shoe prints at the entrance. The bloodstains in the bathroom were covered with aluminum foil to block sunlight and prevent DNA degradation. 10 dehumidifiers were installed throughout the unit, calibrated to keep humidity at around 50%. Low enough to prevent mold from taking hold and destroying the evidence. Mr. Satoru was responsible for swapping out the dehumidifier packs on a monthly and quarterly schedule, and forensic specialists would make regular visits to assess the condition of the scene. Mr. Satoru followed that plan without exception. On the 10th of every single month, he showed up to apartment 302 right on schedule. He would crack the windows for half an hour to let the air circulate, then swap out the filters in the dehumidifier packs. He'd use a soft brush to gently clear any dust that had settled on the protective film, then pull out a thermometer to check the humidity and make sure it was holding at the right level. He never lingered. He always moved quickly, got it done, and left, because every extra minute he spent in that room pulled him back to the day it happened, and that was a pain he could only take in small doses. In May of 2002, the Forensic Science Department brought in newly imported fluorescent bloodstain detection reagents and ran a fresh sweep of the apartment. Down in the crevices of the entryway floor, spots that had been completely overlooked the first time around, technicians found microscopic traces of blood. We're talking pinhead-sized, invisible to the naked eye under normal conditions. Testing confirmed it was type B, consistent with the samples collected back in 1999. It wasn't a breakthrough in itself, but it was something. Additional physical evidence that the scene was still giving up its secrets. Meanwhile, Mr. Satoru was doing his own kind of detective work. He went through every one of Namiko's belongings, her diaries, her letters, her address book, combing through all of it, looking for anything that might point to someone with a reason to hurt her. He found nothing. Her diary entries were entirely about everyday family life. Quiet, ordinary entries about a quiet, ordinary life. There was no mention of any conflict, any tension, anyone who had made her feel unsafe. Starting in 2000, on the 13th of every month, Mr. Satoru and Kohei would head out to Nagoya's busiest shopping districts to hand out flyers. The flyer was straightforward. Namiko's photo and the basic facts of the case on the front, the reward amount and the police tip line on the back. The reward started at 1 million yen, nearly $7,000. By 2020, police had raised it to 3 million yen, about $20,000. In the early years, when Kohei was still small enough to need a stroller, Mr. Satoru would push him through the crowds while working the flyers with his free hand. For anyone willing to stop and listen, he'd explain the whole case and ask, sincerely, without pressure, if they knew anything at all. For anyone who walked past without taking one, he'd simply bow his head. No frustration, no confrontation, just gratitude for their time. As the years dragged on, the Special Task Force quietly shrank. 50 investigators became 10. 10 became 3. 3 veteran detectives keeping the flame alive on what had become, by any official measure, a cold case. Then, one day in 2004, while Mr. Satoru was going through a stack of case documents the police had sent over, he came across something that shook him to his core. Buried in the Criminal Procedure Code was a clause he hadn't known about. Japan's statute of limitations for murder cases was 15 years. The crime had occurred in 1999. That meant that if no one was charged by 2014, the killer would walk free forever, completely beyond the reach of the law. The realization hit him like a freight train. He immediately reached out to families of victims in other unsolved cases, and together they built a grassroots organization they called Hamasu no Kai, which translates roughly to small but persistent. Their mission: abolish the statute of limitations for murder. Over the next 6 years, Mr. Satoru made dozens of trips between Nagoya and Tokyo, testified at parliamentary hearings, and stood on street corners collecting signatures, more than 80,000 of them. In June 2010, the Japanese parliament passed the amendment. The statute of limitations for murder was gone, permanently. When the news came through, Mr. Satoru took Kohei, who was in junior high school by then, into apartment 302. He pointed to the wall calendar, still frozen on November 1999, and told his son, October 13, 2014, Nagoya got its first snow of the season that day, early, even for autumn. Kohei was 17 years old, a high school junior, and he was out in Nagoya Square with his father, handing out flyers in the cold. His fingers had gone red and numb, but he stood there and bowed to every single person who passed, saying the same words he had been saying since he was 5 years old. Please take a look. Help us find the person who murdered my mother. 12 years of saying that. An elderly woman stopped when she saw the two of them, father and son, out in the snow, still fighting, and she couldn't hold back her tears. She took Kohei's hand in both of hers and told him to be brave. That night, Kohei wrote in his diary, Mom is watching us from heaven. We cannot give up. Growing up without his mother had left a gap in Kohei that nothing could fill. Everything he knew about Namiko came from his father's stories and the photographs around the house. In 2025, in an interview with Asahi Shimbun, Kohei reflected on what those years had been like. When I was little, he said, if someone asked where my mother was, I'd say she was very far away and would come back when I grew up. Later, I realized she would never come back. In 2024, Kohei got married. He was 27 years old, and on his wedding day, he made sure his mother was there in the only way she still could be. He placed her photograph in the waiting room, right where guests would see it. Next to the photo, he set a jar of cherry blossom jam, Namiko's favorite. He wanted her to know that he and his father had never stopped, that they hadn't given up, not once. By the end of 2024, the total rent Mr. Satoru had paid on apartment 302 had reached 22.8 million yen, over $150,000, a sum roughly equal to his entire salary across a full decade before he retired. And yet, when people asked him about it, his answer was always the same. It was worth it, every single yen, as long as it helped catch the killer and gave Namiko the justice she deserved. It was also late in 2024 that things began to quietly shift. The Aichi Prefectural Police launched a formal cold case reinvestigation initiative, securing special funding to bring in a nano-analyzer, a piece of forensic equipment with sensitivity 1,000 times greater than what they'd had before. It was capable of pulling complete genetic profiles, even from biological samples that had severely degraded over time. For the first time in years, the evidence sitting inside apartment 302 had a fighting chance of giving up its final secret. At the kickoff meeting for the reinvestigation, a young female officer named Ms. Chikako was assigned to go through the old case files and get everything organized. And that's when she found it. Buried deep in a stack of child psychology counseling records, the statement that 4-year-old Kohei had made back in 2001. Mom was pushed down by the convenience store clerk. Her hand was bleeding. A child's words spoken in an art class over 2 decades ago. She flagged it, and when the team looked at it alongside something else they had, food packaging fibers, the kind commonly found in convenience store environments, recovered from the soil on the suspect's shoe prints, veteran investigator Mr. Saitu Shohei slammed his fist on the table. We've always focused on Namiko's social circle, he said. Did we overlook the circle of Mr. Satoru's acquaintances? That convenience store clerk might have targeted Mr. Satoru from the very beginning. That one insight flipped the entire investigation on its head. For 26 years, police had been looking at Namiko, her friends, her community, her history. Now, for the first time, they turned that lens around and pointed it at Mr. Satoru. They started digging into his past, paying special attention to anyone with a complicated romantic history and anyone who had behaved unusually in the aftermath of the crime. They began rebuilding his life from scratch. And that's when they found the yearbook. From a high school reunion held on October 25th, 1998, just 1 year before the murder, tucked inside its pages was a name, Kumiko Yasufuku. She had written next to her entry, "Seeing Satoru again feels like just yesterday." Records showed she had been Mr. Satoru's classmate back in high school. Back then, she had stood up in front of the entire school and publicly confessed her feelings for him. He had turned her down. At the 1998 reunion, Mr. Satoru had shown up happy, proudly passing around photos of his little family of 3, sharing stories about raising Kohei, glowing with the kind of contentment that can be hard to watch when you're carrying something unresolved. At some point during the evening, Kumiko went pale, said she wasn't feeling well, left early. A few days later, she told an old classmate that she had married a businessman in Osaka and had settled down in Minato. But here's the thing, nobody had ever met this husband. Nobody had ever been to her home, and when police pulled her records, they found she wasn't married at all in 1998. The husband in Osaka was a complete fabrication. In December 1999, just 1 month after the murder, Kumiko packed up and moved from Naka Ward to Minato Ward. She changed her cell phone number. And she quietly switched jobs, leaving her position as a department store cashier to take a job at a convenience store clerk, exactly matching what little Kohei had described. After that, she cut off contact with every single one of her high school classmates. When police had first come around in 2000, they'd reached out to her through the building management. She had refused to be interviewed, citing her mother's illness as the reason, and offered no alibi whatsoever. Then in 2015, after Japan established its national DNA database, investigators went to her door again to request a sample. She refused outright, called it an invasion of privacy, and then filed a formal harassment complaint against the police. On May 22, 2025, Kumiko Yasufuku was officially designated suspect number 1. Her information was entered into a high-priority surveillance system, and police began quietly monitoring her movements and daily activities. The problem was that Kumiko had no prior criminal record, which meant her biological information wasn't sitting in any standard DNA database. They couldn't just run a comparison. They needed another way in. That way in came in June 2025, when police activated a newly established familial DNA comparison database. The system was designed specifically for cold cases. It stored genetic profiles of first-degree relatives of individuals with criminal records, and allowed investigators to work backwards from a family connection to identify an unknown suspect. While pulling together Kumiko's household and personal records, police made a key discovery. Her nephew, a young man named Kenta, had a DNA sample collected back in October 2023 following injuries he sustained in a traffic accident. That sample was in the system. On the 15th, investigators ran a comparison between the DNA profile extracted from the crime scene, evidence, and Kenta's profile in the familial database. The result came back at 99.9% certainty. The mitochondrial DNA, which is inherited exclusively through the maternal line, was a match. That meant the person who left blood at the crime scene and Kenta shared the same maternal mitochondrial DNA. The perpetrator was a woman from the Yasufuku family. On October 12th, Inspector Machimoto Takazuki and 2 members of his team showed up at Kumiko Yasufuku's apartment. Their cover story was straightforward. They were there to follow up on the 2023 traffic accident involving her nephew and needed to verify some personal information. The operation was handled with extreme care. Not a single word about the 26-year-old murder case. They couldn't afford to spook her. After they knocked, the door opened. Kumiko Yasufuku, 69 years old, wearing a dark-colored pajama set, looked at them. Her body went slightly stiff when she saw the badges, but she didn't turn them away. She let them in. During the conversation, Inspector Machimoto's eyes caught something on her left hand, an old scar about 2 centimeters long, right on the knuckle of her second finger. When they asked if she would provide a mouth swab sample to help confirm a kinship matter, she went quiet, a full minute of silence. And then she looked up and asked, "Are you referring to the case in Inabaji District 26 years ago?" The swab was sent to the Forensic Science Department on October 13th. At 6 p.m. on October 29th, the final lab report came back. Kumiko Yasufuku's genetic profile was a perfect match to the bloodstains preserved inside apartment 302. There was no margin for doubt, no possibility of coincidence. At 9 a.m. on October 30th, Inspector Machimoto called Kumiko. He told her she would need to come into the station the following day to assist with a verification related to an old case. The line went silent for 2 full minutes. Then came her answer, clear and steady. "I'll come by myself tomorrow. No need to pick me up." Early the next morning, she came, alone. No lawyer, no family member, nobody. Kumiko Yasufuku walked through the front doors of police headquarters wearing the same dark blue coat she had worn to the 1998 reunion, the night everything had started to unravel inside her. She was carrying an old canvas bag. She walked up to the station chief, presented her ID without being asked, and said, "I am Kumiko Yasufuku. I am here to surrender." Under the lights of the interrogation room, after 26 years of silence, she finally talked. It had started back in high school, when the boy she loved stood up in front of the entire school and turned her down. She had never let it go. She had carried that rejection quietly for years, tucking it away, telling herself it was over. But then came the reunion in 1998. And there was Mr. Satoru, happy, relaxed, passing around photos of his beautiful wife and his baby boy, talking about what a wonderful life he had built. Something broke open in her that night. The resentment she thought she had buried came flooding back, and this time it didn't settle. It grew. It curdled into something uglier. Jealousy turned into obsession, and obsession turned into a desire for revenge. After the reunion, she started showing up at the convenience store near Mr. Satoru's home every day, watching, learning his schedule and his routines. By October 1999, she had overheard neighbors talking about Namiko, how she had just finished putting together a child-rearing guide, how helpful and knowledgeable she was. Kumiko saw her opening. She would use parenting advice as a reason to knock on the door. She found out what brand of milk Namiko preferred and went all the way to the Nishimikawa region to buy some as a supposed gift. She deliberately chose a pair of limited edition Korean shoes to wear that day, calculating that if she left prints behind, investigators would assume the killer was an outsider. Someone from out of the country or at least out of the area. And that calculation, combined with her move to a new ward just 1 month after the crime and her invented story about a husband in Osaka, had been enough to keep the police off her trail through the entire initial investigation. At 12:05 p.m. on October 13, 1999, she knocked on the door of apartment 302. Namiko let her in, and then Kumiko saw it, the family photo on the wall, that smiling face, that life that should have been hers in her mind. She lost control. An argument broke out. In a panic, she pulled out a utility knife she had brought with her and stabbed Namiko. During the struggle, the blade caught her own left finger. She ducked into the bathroom, washed the wound as quickly as she could, and ran, leaving behind the shoe prints, the blood in the sink, the drops on the entryway floor. All the evidence that had been waiting, perfectly preserved, for 26 years. She paused in the middle of her confession. Her voice dropped. Kohei was sitting on the floor crying, she said. I couldn't bear to look at him. And then she broke down completely. For years, I changed jobs, 3 different convenience stores. But I always dream of that child's eyes and the bloodstains at the entrance. On November 1st, 2025, Mr. Satoru walked into apartment 302 for the first time without the dehumidifier packs in his hand. He didn't need them anymore. The family photo was still on the wall. Namiko's smile, Kohei's little face, all of it exactly as it had been left. On the coffee table, the Yamato transport delivery notice was still sitting where the driver had placed it all those years ago. Next to it, the milk powder and the diapers, still in their original packaging, never opened. That same day, NHK's long-running Unsolved Mysteries program aired its scheduled episode on the case. The producers had added just one small caption to the corner of the screen, "Suspect arrested on October 31st." In the footage, investigators carefully peeled back the protective film that had covered the entryway floor for over a quarter of a century. The bloodstains underneath had oxidized to a deep, dark red over the decades, but the shoe prints pressed into them were still there, still clear, still 24 centimeters. Mr. Satoru, watching from nearby, spoke quietly to the camera. I don't want revenge, he said. I just don't want her to have died in vain. After the arrest, the Aichi Prefectural Police released a full accounting of everything the investigation had required. Over 26 years, 13 separate teams of criminal investigators had worked this case. The oldest among them was 81 years old. When someone called to tell him the suspect had finally been arrested, he wept. He was in a hospital bed when he heard the news. Another autumn wind moved through Inabaji District, and for the first time in 26 years, the curtains of apartment 302 were drawn open. Sunlight came pouring into that long, sealed room, washing over the unopened package on the table, the frozen calendar on the wall, the silver hair of the man standing in the middle of it all. Mr. Satoru reached into his pocket, pulled out the key, and turned it one last time. That worn brass Mitsubishi key, smooth from thousands of days of being held, carried, gripped through grief and exhaustion and an unwillingness to quit, had finally done what it was always meant to do. Not just open a door, close a chapter. This case will go down as one of Japan's most extraordinary cold cases, not only for how it was solved, but for the man who refused to let it go cold in the first place. For over 26 years, Satoru Takaba paid rent on a room he never slept in, showed up every month with his dehumidifier packs, pushed a stroller through shopping districts with a stack of flyers, traveled to Tokyo to fight for a law that didn't yet exist, and stood in the snow with his teenage son telling strangers about a woman most of the world had forgotten. He did all of that quietly, without rage, without spectacle, just a husband who made a promise in front of a casket and kept it for the rest of his life. Kumiko Yasufuku will now face the legal consequences of what she did, but the wound she left in the Takaba family will never fully heal. What we can say is this: Namiko can rest now. And Kohei, that little boy sitting on the hallway floor with his toy car, too young to understand what he had just lost, is a grown man today with a wife and a mother's photo on the wall at his wedding. He can finally begin to close the most painful chapter of his life, carrying with him the knowledge that truth and justice, no matter how long they take, do eventually find their way home. The door to apartment 302 stayed closed for 26 years of grief and waiting. When it finally opened, it let in the light. Today's video ends here. We'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.